Hi, this is Paul, and this is part of my Rough Draft for Sunday series where I walk through my intended Sunday sermon, at least the degree that it's put together on Friday, and I see how it goes, and I might even edit it in between. As those of you watching this video and the people in my church know, I've been paying a lot of attention to Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson is this Canadian psychologist, and he teaches at University of Toronto. And he's been doing a lot of videos and getting a lot of attention for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the things that often fascinates people about him, and they have questions about him, is in terms of his relationship to Christianity. And as what boils down into these two interviews where the conversation was directed to him and wanting to get a sense of his relationship with Christianity. As so often happens, the conversation boils down to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I think for a lot of people who aren't Christians, it's not immediately obvious why the conversations always go here. But the more you understand Christianity, the more you understand its relationship with history and in the world, the better you can understand why this question of Christianity boils down to the resurrection. One of the most prominent New Testament scholars, N.T. Wright, who likes to write really big books like this one, his take on the resurrection is that the resurrection, it probably the only way to explain the shape and existence of the church, which went on to change the world, would be to believe that the disciples of Jesus, definitely saw something that they understood to be Jesus, and this launched them and their new religion an entirely different and unique trajectory. And so that's part of the reason why so often the conversation comes down to resurrection. But then also with one of the things with Peterson that also gets interesting is people ask him, well, do you believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus? And his answers get very complicated on that and often don't satisfy the people that are asking them. But then he'll also get into this question of why he doesn't go to church, because he doesn't go to church, and he isn't a baptized, professing, active member of any church. In fact, he made up kind of a church of his own because someone wanted to do a wedding for him. So he got one of those little internet credential websites and got a credential so he could do weddings. And so he talks about he doesn't go to church because pastors are lying most of the time. He has his own particular take on what this lying is. But I don't want to be too hard on Jordan Peterson here, because if you look at the culture, understanding Easter is not necessarily a huge thing. I saw on a website this week, someone said, why isn't there a war on Easter like there's a war on Christmas? And I think part of that is because so I like doing this Google image search to try to get a sense of the zeitgeist. So I just image searched Easter on Google, and this is what you come up with. You come up with bunnies and eggs, and if someone grows up in our culture, they might have zero understanding or assumption that Easter has any Christian roots. Now, the conversation about where this word Easter comes from and pagan connections in terms of European history and so on and so forth, that gets large. Now, if you throw Sunday into the mix, then suddenly it all looks quite a bit more Christian-y and churchy. You have He is risen, Easter Sunday, He is risen, death is defeated, He is risen, so on and so forth. So there suddenly, when you put Easter and Sunday, even though Easter always falls on a Sunday on our calendar, it all seems to come together. Now, C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles makes a very interesting observation with respect to Easter. This is what he says. It's very important to be clear about what these people meant, meaning the people, the apostles, and the people who began Christianity. When modern writers talk of resurrection, they usually mean one particular moment, the discovery of an empty tomb and the appearance of Jesus a few yards away from it. And this is exactly where all of these conversations with Peterson tend to go. Was this the same Jesus that was crucified and put into the tomb, and could you touch his hands, and all of these kinds of things? But Lewis says this would have been very strange to the early Christians, this focus right on this. And by saying this, I'm not trying to undermine it. I'm just making the observation that Lewis makes, and we're going to understand some of this when we take a look at the New Testament stories. The story of that moment is what Christian apologists now chiefly try to support and skeptics chiefly try to impugn. But this almost exclusive concentration on the first 5 minutes or so of the resurrection would have astonished the earliest Christian teachers. In claiming to have seen the resurrection, they are not necessarily claiming to have seen that, meaning that moment. The resurrection to which they bore witness was, in fact, not the action of rising from the dead, but the state of having risen, a state, as they held, attested by intermittent meetings during a limited period of time, except for the special and in some ways different meeting vouchsafed by St. Paul. And he's talking about the story that Paul tells in Acts, or Luke tells in Acts a number of times. And we're gonna see this because actually for the next few Sundays in this next sermon series I'm gonna walk through all of the post-resurrection stories, and we're gonna look a little bit at what Lewis has to say here. But this termination of the period is important, for as we see, there's no possibility of isolating the doctrine of the resurrection from that of ascension. And when we get down to Ascension Sunday, which is Ascension Day is usually a Thursday, but when we meet on the Sunday after that, we'll talk about it, and then Pentecost, and we'll kind of frame out this whole section. But Lewis's point here is that all of our conversation naturally heads to the material. And there's some really important and historical reasons for that. And please do not misunderstand anything I'm about to say as to downplay what we would call the historical, material, literal, bodily resurrection of Jesus. Please don't understand anything I'm about to say or have said in terms of undermining that. But what Lewis is mentioning is that when the New Testament church talked about resurrection, they didn't just talk about this moment that happens. It's kind of like saying you go to the tomb and, oh, there he is. Well, that's that. What does that mean? But this whole period that goes from Easter to Ascension Day to Pentecost, which begins to map out and which really, as N.T. Wright notes, launches the church. And N.T. Wright, now talking about the Mark account, which we're about to read, notes the strangeness of this in the story. See, because he says, the first thing the first surprise when we read the resurrection stories in the canonical Gospels ought to be that they are told with virtually no embroidery from the biblical tradition. Now again, N.T. Wright is a very significant, I move my desk and I get some jiggle. A very significant New Testament scholar. And his point here is that, for example, if you take a look at the Good Friday stories and you compare them to the Easter story, there's something very different happening here. Now, along the way with my Jordan Peterson journey, I've made a bunch of new friends, one of whom is Jonathan Pageau, and Jonathan has his own YouTube channel where he talks about the symbolic world, and he's an artist who makes things for Orthodox churches, and who does art for Orthodox churches. And Jonathan, uses his channel to try to educate contemporary audiences on symbolism. Now he being an artist, this makes absolutely perfect sense, because he being an artist, he majors in symbolism. Now, symbolism is obviously a big factor of the biblical story, and here is just I should really have sponsors from booksellers. This is IVP, Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. And if you're interested in biblical imagery and symbolism, you can go through this book and just, really nerd out on the stuff. But Pageau, what N.T. Wright is saying is that, for example, if you read the Good Friday texts, what you have here is that the Good Friday texts are replete with connections to the day of the Lord and to the sun being darkened and to this long Old Testament tradition. And anybody reading those texts who was well versed in the Hebrew scriptures would immediately begin to connect the dots between Jesus' crucifixion and the Old Testament prophets and what they had to say about God's judgment on a disobedient people and the end of time and the day of the Lord. I mean, when you read the Good Friday accounts, the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, they're completely told within the frame of the Old Testament prophets and everything going on there. And we actually get some of this when we look at later gospels. For example, there's a Gospel of Peter, which is a 2nd or 3rd century gospel. As there, sometimes people come out and say, "Oh, here's another gospel," and they're like, "Oh, this has been subverted or repressed." But actually, the ancient church very much knew these gospels and rejected them for certain specific reasons. And part of what's interesting about the Gospel of Peter here is it makes the point that N.T. Wright is making here, because when you read the Gospel of Peter, you have the moment, exactly what Hollywood would show, and while they were narrating what they had seen, they saw 3 men come out of the sepulchre, 2 of them supporting the other, and a cross following them. And the heads of the 2 reached to the heaven, but that of him who was being led reached beyond the heavens. Now, this is all symbolic, mythological language, especially kind of the floating cross coming out of the tomb. And they heard a voice out of the heavens crying, "Have you preached to those who sleep?" And from the cross there was heard the answer, "Yes." And this is exactly the kind of embroidery that N.T. Wright is talking about when he talks about the fact that when you get to the 4 canonical gospels that you'll find in the Bible, there's none of this. In fact, when you read those texts, what you begin to think is that the people who are articulating this are just doing their best to tell the story, in a sense, right out of the video feed of their eyes. And they haven't put it together yet. They haven't made sense of it. And in fact, this will kind of be the long work of Christian theology that follows them. So right away you have at the end of, now remember the chapter breaks in the Gospels are all, these are all added quite a bit later, but so at the end of chapter 27 in the Gospel of Matthew, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. Mark 15:47, Mary Magdalene and the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. So now we know, who helped Joseph of Arimathea put Jesus in the tomb. Now, one of the things that confuses people is that there are a lot of Marys around. Well, almost 50% of the little girls born to Jewish families at this period were named Mary. So there's a lot of Marys around, and that's why you always get the other Mary, or Mary Magdalene, or Mary the mother of Jesus, or Mary the mother of Joseph, or Mary the mother of James. And so there's lots and lots of Mary, so they have to differentiate them somehow. So that's how they differentiate them. But now you might wonder, well, why do all of these accounts have different people in it? Well, there's a British scholar, Richard Bauckham, who's done an extensive study of the Gospels and begins to try to answer this question. Why if, and we talked about this last week and we'll visit that again, why if Matthew and Luke clearly are dependent on Mark, why do Matthew and Luke sometimes have names that Mark doesn't have? And why do Matthew and Luke sometimes not include names that Mark has? And as a result of this long study that Richard Bauckham does, he said basically, the naming in these Gospels were like footnotes. And these were people that the intended community of these books would have known and have access to in order to vouchsafe, in order to validate the story being told. In other words, these are the eyewitnesses. You read this in the book and you say, I can't believe this is true. And you see, well, there's Mary, the mother of Joseph. Well, both of which are very common names. Well, we kind of know who that was. Who are they talking about? That's that old woman who lives over there. Go talk to her. So you go down the street and you talk to her, say, hey, I just heard this thing. Is this true? She say, yeah, it's true. Well, now suddenly you believe it a little differently. You say, well, I'm not so sure about that. Then you find another name in the book because they didn't have access to all 4 books because the books are written over a process of time. And so then they look up this other person. They say, hey, is this bit true? And they'll say, yeah, it's true. And this is how these writers would in a sense validate the story they're telling, that they completely understand is not an easy story to swallow. So here's the story from Mark. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. In the rush to put Jesus in the tomb before the beginning of the Sabbath, these were all observant Jews, and so these women came to do the dirty work to finish up the job of properly burying Jesus, and they do so on what we call Sunday today, which was after the end of the Sabbath, where they could finish this work. And now it's important to remember again that even though Jesus had on a number of occasions talked about his resurrection, nobody believed him. None of the disciples go to the tomb to say, oh, here he's going to come out, and just these women come. And it's also important to remember that women were not considered to be reliable witnesses in the ancient culture. Yet women are the first witnesses to the resurrection. So very early the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they went on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? Now again, this question is completely understandable given the context of what we're looking at, because this is they're intent on doing this job, this grisly job that they have to do, and then they know they have a problem because the stone that is in front of the tomb is heavy, and these are 3 women, and do they have the strength to move this stone? But then they looked up and they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed, as well they should be. And now again, what's interesting about all of these 4 Gospels and all of the story in all of the Gospels is that one of the things that the church never did was to take the 4 and correct them. Now later copiers of the Bible and different editors would in fact try to do this kind of thing. But the church in its wisdom said, here's the evidence. We're going to just record what the witnesses say. And what we do understand about human witnesses is that, well, people get stories different. And we also understand that, the tellers of each of these stories, you select different people and shape it in a different way. But the church has always said, we're going to let these 4 stories be just like they are. That's the witness. That's the testimony. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where he laid. But go, tell the disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, one of the ways that you know that a story is fabricated is because people clean it up. And, movies go into this. Kids on the playground understand this. When something happens and you want to get your story straight, you get a group of people together and you all tell the same story because that's convincing. You don't have any of that here. What we seem to be getting is the raw feed from the people who were there, now edited by these 4 people who might have had access to different ones of these people. And what we also have here is that if you look in your Bibles and you find after Mark 16:8, there is a big footnote. And the big footnote says, what follows here, which may or may not be in your Bible, depending on what modern edited book that you possess, what's added here is from later manuscripts. And this gets into this entire tradition of, in the ancient world before the printing press had manuscripts and everything had to be copied. And copiers, unlike copy machines or printing presses, read the text and correct things that they think are wrong, and they in a sense add to them. And so what we actually believe happened is that it's quite likely that because the end of the Gospel of Mark was at the end of the scroll, and that's the place that gets worn, that the ending was lost of this gospel. And so over hundreds of years later, lots of writers came along and tried to add their own ending. And you can read yourself in the Bible some of these different endings of the Gospel of Mark. But one of the things, again, that we saw last week is that because Matthew and Luke both depend on Mark, we've got a pretty good idea about where Mark goes with this, because it will probably look something like Matthew and something like Luke, because again, they're dependent on Mark. And one of the things that you see even just already in the Mark version is that, well, who are the apostles? And again, C.S. Lewis for Miracles. In the earliest days of Christianity, an apostle was first and foremost a man. And again, it's important that he's a man because, again, men were seen as reliable witnesses and women were not, which is part of the reason apostles were men and they weren't women, even though women are all over the story of Jesus, and a careful reading of the gospel accounts show this. In fact, women were some of the most devoted disciples of Jesus, and you can talk about Mary, the sister of Martha, because you always have to designate them, and the sister of Lazarus, and how she sits at Jesus' feet, and the different ways that the gospel writers go into this. But these apostles were men, and the thing was that they're claimed to be eyewitnesses of the resurrection. And again, C.S. Lewis is making the point, not eyewitnesses of the moment of resurrection, which is the thing that we tend to focus on, but eyewitnesses of the fact of the resurrection. Meaning that the thing about people is that you might say, well, maybe you're old enough to have seen John F. Kennedy on TV, or maybe you met him in person. Say, well, I met John Kennedy, and like Benson in that famous vice presidential debate where he says, you're no John F. Kennedy, you're no Jack Kennedy. I don't remember exactly what he said, but the point of these apostles is that they knew Jesus, and they knew him before and after. Only a few days after the crucifixion, when two candidates were nominated for the vacancy created by the treachery of Judas, their qualifications was that they had known Jesus personally, both before and after his death, and could offer first-hand evidence of the resurrection in addressing the outer world. This was, in fact, what apostles did. And as N.T. Wright notes, the story implies, especially in Mark, that the disciples are to be rehabilitated. The singing out of Peter for special mention seems obviously designed to not go with the tragic stories of his denial of Jesus, not at the moment at least to suggest anything about his leadership in the movement was about to begin in a new way. This mention of Peter with reference back to his denial ties in closely with 14:26-31. There, as here, is also mentioned that Jesus is going before them into Galilee. And so this is the roots of the story, that in fact, the key of the resurrection here is not that, Jesus is in the flesh, although that is, again, critically important for other deep theological reasons that I'm going to mention at the end of this sermon, but that the story continues, that Jesus' execution at the hands of the Romans, at the behest of the religious leaders, does not end the story. In fact, it dramatically changes the story and dramatically changes history from now on. And this is kind of where we pick up today, because we have the question of the church and the risen Lord. And what does this mean that Jesus is alive? And what does this mean that, as we're going to see at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. What does this mean that Jesus ascended? What does this mean that Jesus says he's coming again? Well, this is in fact the entire story of the church, and this launches the church. But now you might say, well, this has been a very interesting academic conversation about Jesus and the resurrection and how it fits in and what it means. Well, actually, it means something very much to each of us. Now, the story of the Bible, again, begins in Genesis with this creation. And the story is basically told of the king who makes the world, and he places the steward in the garden, and in a sense, nature is our sister. And we are called, we are given dominion over nature, kind of like an older brother is to look after a little sister, and we're given that kind of power. Now what happens, if you know the story, of course, is that there's rebellion. And I think I want to change these slides. I don't like these slides. That there's rebellion. And so back to this representation that I've used before. You have heaven and earth here in the creation, and heaven and earth are in a sense God's footstool, or God's garden, or God's kingdom, or God's temple, as you see in Genesis 1. And then there comes the rebellion, where the stewards rebel against the king. And then nature, in a sense, rebels against her. It's the older brother rebelling against the father, and the younger sister, therefore, rebelling against the older brother. And what you have there is civil war. And the question is, well, who wins? Well, what ironically happens is that nature, the younger sister, nature rebels against the brother, and in a sense, the brother and the sister are always at odds, and they're always fighting. And in fact, if you look at the cosmological story of the secular contemporary world, the end of that story is nature finally wins. The stewards finally lose. We die. Now, what happens in Jesus' story then? Well, this is the picture of the rebellion and where this goes. But what happens in Jesus' story is that the stewards are renewed. And they again come into proper obedience and submission to the great king or to the Father. And nature too is restored. And this is in fact the story of the resurrection. And this is why Easter is so important for the entire Christian story. Now, too often churches say, well, Jesus is risen, therefore death is defeated, and that's true. But this bigger picture of the entire story of a renewed creation, because what Jesus comes out of the tomb with is creation 2.0. He is now resurrected flesh, and all of the universe will again take on that resurrected flesh. And for example, I can drop this into this. All actually gets laid out in the book of Colossians. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And this is the Christian story. This is how it all fits together, where you've got the king and the representative of the king being his son, who everyone in the ancient in the world would have understood to speak for the Father. And he comes, and through this drama remakes the steward, remakes creation. And what he comes out of the tomb with is in fact creation 2.0, his new resurrected body. And we're already beginning to see the renewal of the stewards and the renewal of creation. And this all happens in the resurrection. Once you were alienated from God, you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. So now you can begin to draw the lines together and ask yourself, well, how does this all hold together? What does the resurrection mean? And it doesn't just mean, okay, what happened in that first 5 minutes? It means, what is the implication that Jesus is Lord? What is the implication that Jesus is alive? And what is the implication, not just simply that Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago, and this is just another element of reported history, just like how many other events, but that Jesus continues to reign. And of course, this for Lewis ties into obviously the ascension and the day of Pentecost with the Spirit. But it also boils down into this question of church. Well, what is the church? And now, not unlike if you came out and saw Jesus' resurrected body, and you'd wonder, well, why the scars? Why the wounds? And you look at the church and you say, oh gosh, why the chaos? Why the tragedy? Why the stumblings? Why the humanity of this thing that is supposed to be the body of Christ? And this body looks like it's been beaten up pretty bad. Well, this gets into the Christian life, and as I do in most of my sermons, I talk about the Christian life in terms of misery, deliverance, gratitude. The misery that we cannot make our way to God. The deliverance that the entire gospel story is one of God working rescue on our behalf for us. And then the Christian life is actually gratitude. How can I respond to this if I believe it? Now the truth is, if you don't believe Jesus has risen from the dead, you're probably not going to go to church, because why should you? If you don't believe that Jesus is alive and has been risen from the dead and reigns on high, then why on earth would you ever go to church? Now, you might show up in church on Easter because this is kind of a curiosity, but then the question is, will you come to church next week? Well, maybe I feel in the moment like, well, I kind of feel like Jesus is here. But if you actually believe that Jesus is here, and if you want to act as if Jesus is alive and as if Jesus reigns, well, what are actions in keeping with acting as if any of this is true? Well, what will you do with your time? Will you come to church next week? Will you worship every day in every aspect of your life? Well, what do you mean by worship? Well, worship is the way that you give thanks to someone for having given you a gift. Worship is a way that you honor someone greater than yourself. And again, if you remember this whole narrative of creation, worship is what you do to the king. And now, obviously, formally, when you come before the king, you will do, formal ceremonial acts of obedience, and you'll do this with your body, and you'll do this with language, and you'll do this with gifts, and you do all of those things. But you will also act as if you are a servant of that king, and you will behave as if you are obedient to that king, and you will live out as if that king is actually king over your life. And obviously, and what happens in the Christian church is that we practice this, that we believe that, in fact, in a sense, the bread that we break and the body that we share on the night that Jesus was betrayed, took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body. This is what feeds the stewards of the great king. This is the way that they obey. This is the way that they are nourished and fed by him." Now, obviously, you see the symbolic world in that, but here's the thing about Easter. It's in the resurrection of Jesus that the new creation is inaugurated in the midst of the old creation. And so here we are in the midst of the old creation, with the flesh of the old creation decaying, hair falling out, getting sick, growing older, dying, that inwardly the new life begins. And so that resurrection day becomes the first day of the second coming. And all of the days until then, what we do in the Christian life, what we do in the Christian church, is we begin to try to live out that new day, because we believe it has come, which is why Christians always talk about the end times, because the end begins at Easter and continues until its culmination in the day when, in a sense, meaning and matter all come together completely and forever. And that's the Christian story. And that's Easter.